and today our question comes to us from Lady Kai. And Lady Kai has this question. How important is pronunciation when dealing with deities? Will deity be offended if a name is pronounced incorrectly? And there are a lot of people in the pagan world, and I'm sure on YouTube, who will tell you this is very important. And you must have the right pronunciation or terrible things will happen, blah, 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 woof, woof. I, however, would say to you, what on earth makes you think there's a correct pronunciation? What do you mean, correct pronunciation, and how would you determine such a thing? If you mean a correct pronunciation in the English language, well then there may be an answer, although it might not just be one. But if you're talking about the languages that these deities were first worshipped in, establishing a correct pronunciation is not at all an easy question, and in general there is no such thing. And in some cases it's literally impossible to approach it. In others there are educated guesses, but it would involve questions such as how do you determine which is the correct form when there are several from different regions, none of which appears to be older than the others? And various other linguistic questions as well. Language is not a static thing. It's never static. It's not static now. It wasn't static then. And if you look at the English language, you can see this very clearly. If you look at how English is pronounced today, it has changed substantially over the last 100 years. Certainly not enough to make it unintelligible or even remotely unintelligible, but in terms of pronunciation and grammar, there have been significant changes. There have been changes just during my lifetime. One of the biggest is that many speakers of American English now use a Mediterranean vowel structure, which they did not use previously. It has been a shift. And there have been many other shifts as well, and certainly will continue to be. If you go back and look at 19th century English, you'll see that it's in many ways very different, and the pronunciations could be very different as well, depending on the region and the dialect being spoken. English has several dialects. Now, go back 400 years to Shakespeare's English, early modern English. It's modern English, as we speak modern English, but it's the earlier form, and we've already changed substantially in just those 400 years how we speak English and how we pronounce it. And you can see this very clearly in writing of the time, where it's obvious they were not pronouncing certain words the same way we do. And in fact, it's become very fashionable in recent years to mount productions of Shakespeare using the pronunciation of that time, which is very different from modern English. Now, go back 100 years farther, and you'll find yourself dealing with Middle English, the English of Chaucer. Chaucer's easy to find. Go look it up and see what Middle English looks like. If you have a very good education, you may be able to pick your way through it, but most people will have a very hard time understanding Middle English. And if you go back to the time of the Norman Conquest and Old English, most contemporary English speakers, unless they've actually studied Old English itself, will be totally lost with Old English. The current English language certainly comes from it, but it can be very hard to see how if you don't know. And this is just 1,000 years. Now, look at a culture like Egypt, and many contemporary pagans worship Egyptian deities. Egyptian culture thrived for 4,000 years, from about 3,500 BC to about 400 AD. And you'd better believe that language changed during those 4,000 years. Not only that, but it had many dialects. And at several points in Egyptian history, it's remarked that people from Upper Egypt could not really understand people from Lower Egypt. They spoke very differently. At other periods in Egyptian history, the everyday spoken language was not the language of literate people who spoke earlier forms of the language, which had not necessarily been the common form spoken even in earlier times, but specifically were literate forms of the language. And it's the same with Greek. Modern Greek is not remotely the same as Koine Greek, which was spoken during the Hellenistic era, and Koine Greek is not nearly the same thing as Classical Greek, which had many different dialects, which are not all that close together in many cases. And this, again, is different from pre-classical Greek, which is barely understood. And if you're talking about a Greek deity, which would be the correct pronunciation? Let's look at one. Let's look at Persephone. What would be the correct form of the name of this goddess? Well, it depends on what language you're approaching her in. Are you speaking English? Well, then Persephone is the generally accepted form. Are you looking for the language she was approached in ancient times? Well, there wasn't just one. There were all these different dialects. She was not called the same name, let alone the same pronunciation, by all of these different people. Persephone is the Ionic form of the name, and the Homeric form is Persephoneia. But in actual spoken Greek, there are many dialectical differences ranging from Persipasa to Persipata to Proserpine, which gave rise to the Latin Proserpina. And, I've heard people try to describe Proserpina as a bastardization of Persephone. It's nothing of the sort. It's a direct importation of a dialectical version of that goddess's name, because there were many different dialects and they did not sound the same. So all of this comes down to the question of what would be the correct pronunciation, and in most cases, how are you going to establish it? Because there were so many different pronunciations. And even in English, there are often different pronunciations depending on what dialect of English you're speaking. So I hope this little talk gives you an idea of how complex this question actually is. And it's not at all a simple question, and people who treat it as a simple question are definitely shortchanging this question. But in my opinion, no deity would not be offended by your not having the correct pronunciation, because nobody speaking today is likely to have one, if in fact there was a correct pronunciation at all. And if you look at the ancient world, these deities had worshippers speaking many different dialects and sometimes many different languages, and it obviously did not bother them then, so why would it bother them now? So I would say don't worry so much about pronunciation. It is good if you can pronounce it correctly in English. And if you want to try to use a form from one of the older languages, that's fine, but I don't think deity cares. And if they did, it would have been an issue back then, not just now. So those are my thoughts. Hope you find them helpful, and until next time, may you blessed be. Please join me for our Corellian peace prayer. I pray for peace. I pray for love. I pray for stability. I pray for the nation where I live. I pray for the world.